village, and at low water it was 3 miles away, 3 miles out. And we kids played out on those sands as very young children, and then the childhood changed from happiness to a bit of concern, because in 1939, September, this weird-looking chap, he looked a bit like Charlie Chaplin on steroids, decided he wanted a war and buggered everything up, and all the guys over the age of 18 disappeared from the village, leaving only the old fishermen and us young children. And the fishing smacks, they were only sort of 40-foot, 36-foot fishing boats. They only went out for 12 hours, sometimes 24. They all lay on moorings in the estuary, which at high water, of course, were well afloat, but at low water were a quarter of a mile out from the sea wall and hard aground. I mean, they ebbed right out. But the fishermen had to use dinghies to get to and fro, and there were no inflatables. They used 12-foot clinker-built dinghies. But these dinghies had the tonnage displacement of a fuller's ferry. I mean, they were strong and built very strong. And so by 1942, I'd achieved the age of 10, and together with some other colleagues of mine, because we were always playing in the water and on the sea, we used to get the job of rowing these dinghies up and down, picking them up when the tide was ebbing. We'd have to go down, get the anchor in wherever they'd been left last, and then we'd row them up and down until the fishermen arrived, and then they'd go out to the smacks. And on the flood tide, we'd have to do the opposite, but keep them afloat, basically, to help the fishermen. And occasionally we had to go out and work on the fishing smacks, because we only went to school half a day each day. The reason for that was that all the evacuees from Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham were all sent to live in the villages, so they were away from the bombing. And the school could only accommodate a small number of us, so we all shared. We did half a day each. And so the other half day we had to work, and the girls knitted and made things for the soldiers. Some of the boys worked on the farms, and some of us worked on the fishing smacks and in the dinghies. But at the age of 10, I could row one of these things up and down the estuary, out of the tide. I knew where to keep out the tide. I could scull, and so could the other lads. Wonderful start. Absolutely marvellous. Tell you about because I've imparted this information to Bob to help him with his meteorological career, that my grandfather taught me when I was still a very young child on the fishing smacks. And he said, "Comes the wind before the rain, soon you will make sail again. But comes the rain before the wind, because otherwise it doesn't rhyme, topsail sheets and halyards mind." And it was a description of frontal systems and what happens with them. And I told Bob, because I thought it would be helpful. Yeah, exactly. But my old grandfather told me that. Anyhow, if I dwell on that, we'll never get any further. So then I was 16. I knew all about the sea. In fact, I knew all about everything at 16. It's a common trend, yeah? And had strong opinions, very strong opinions. And I wanted to be a captain on a ship. My dad was a captain. My grandfather was captain of fishing boats. And I wanted to be a captain, so my parents got me an apprenticeship with the Boo Steamship Company of Liverpool. And on the 14th of March, 1949, I was dispatched on a steam train to Sunderland on the northeast coast. And of course I was an apprentice. I had a uniform with brass buttons and a peaked cap. And I felt that I was well on my way to command as I was going up on the train, and I was pondering on how you would deal with recalcitrant crew and things like that. And this feeling of sort of joviality lasted until I actually got aboard the ship lying in Sunderland and was met by the second mate. And he said, "Right, your berth is there. You get this flash gear off. You put your dungarees, now known as jeans. Get those on in your working gear, and the last you'll see if that is when we get back to the UK, and it was. So that was right. I had to work with the sailors, and there were 34, they were described nautical terms. I apologize for sometimes indelicacy, but this is about the sea. 34 hairy-arsed Geordies. And so we sailed, and everything was quite busy. We loaded in London and then some continental ports, and then we left for Brazil, where the run was to Brazil. So not a lot happened in these first few days because everybody was very busy and very tired. But once we sailed from France and we got out of the Channel and across the Bay of Biscay, the first thing that I found that I actually, with this vast knowledge, didn't know was that on British merchant ships in those days, there were no TVs and there were no transistor radios, and the only form of entertainment was the apprentice, the young apprentice. And by the time I'd been aboard that ship 3 weeks, I knew nothing, and I had no opinions on anything, and that's lasted to this day. If you ask me what my opinion is on something, I'll say, well, what do you think? And sometimes I'll recoil in case you... So, boy, I learned very, very fast. It was a wonderful learning, the best I could have had, and the bruises have gone. But, as an apprentice, I had to work with the sailors on deck, learning all splicing and painting and chipping, and for a while I couldn't understand how this was leading me to my captaincy. But obviously I didn't dare say too much by now. But I also had to keep a watch, and this was important because now I'm on the bridge. And I thought, well, this at least is getting closer to being the captain. And I actually thought, it's so easy to be the captain. He didn't do anything because I was with the mate on the 4 to 8 watch in the morning, and the captain used to come about 7 o'clock, and he'd have a chat with the mate, and he'd have a cup of tea, and then he'd go down again, ready for his breakfast. And I thought, I can do that now without any more training. But anyway, the mate was Mr. Garrett, and I think his family loved him, and some of the guys on the ship thought he was all right, but he actually had the charisma of a chainsaw. And he also took a dislike to me. I think it was my accent. And Mr. Garrett used to take star sights. The mate takes star sights in the morning watch and star sights in the evening watch, because that's when it's twilight. You can't take them in the dark, and you can't take them in the daylight. So that was fine. And he liked to have his pot of tea, a big pint pot of tea, and toast before he took his star sights. And that was a delight for me because I got off the bridge and down to the nice warm galley to make this. And there were no kettles on bridges then and toasters, nothing like that. Bring up his tea and toast, put it inside, and he would close the wheelhouse door and I'd stay out on the wing of the bridge. And we was fine, and we were heading down the Bay of Biscay, but when we got to Finisterre, in the Portuguese coast, we struck off in a sort of westerly direction. Now, up to this point, my navigational tuition, if you like, had got to the level of sharpening the pencils in the chart room and polishing the brass on the compass. But beyond that, nothing. So I knew nothing about the fact that longitude and time were related and changed. And it was all right till we started heading southwest. And so this was where I got my first and very lasting, I'll have to tell you, character assessment from Mr. Garrett, the mate. Because he appeared this morning, the wheelhouse door slid back, and I really welcomed the warm air that shot out of the wheelhouse when he came out, but he was already holding his sextant. And he said, Croft, he said, I'm going to ask you a question. And I thought, oh, brilliant, brilliant. He's going to ask me something and then tell me the answer, and I'll have learned some navigation. And he said, I want you to tell me what the 3 most useless things on planet Earth are. And I said, but before I had a chance to say anything, because you've got to look as though you're thinking about it, otherwise the questioner is insulted. So he said, never mind. He said, I'll tell you. The first is tits on a bull. Well, Yes, sir. Yeah, that's fine. The second, he said, is a man with only one leg at an asking party. And I was pondering on that. And he said, the third is you. And that has stuck with me to this day. Well, and it'll come up later in this little chat. So anyway, I then learned that it was better to look and see the first signs of the stars getting a little bit faded in the sky. I was down to make his tea. Plus, I still didn't know about longitude and time, but I knew it was getting light. So that was all right, and I proceeded to have a very, very happy and beneficial apprenticeship, 4 years up and down the River Amazon. By the time I was 17, I'd been a couple of times up the Amazon, down to Rio de Janeiro, up the Empire State Building, and looked out of the crown in the Statue of Liberty, because you could climb right up inside, and all these things. And then I came home and had to do some study and get my tickets. And so we've got to fast forward quite a bit now to where I was second mate on a ship called the Aldington Court. And the Aldington Court was a British tramp. More accurately, a London Greek, they were called. They were owned by Greek owners who lived in London in rich apartments. And she was an empire boat built during the war, 10,000 tons. There were lots of them. Grand old ship, but you never knew where you were going next. We carried the charts for the whole world in her, and we needed them during this trip that I did in her, which was a long, long time. We went to every ocean and every sea except the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Every one, North Pacific, South Pacific, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, Indian Ocean, the lot, everywhere. Picking up cargoes and going wherever there was a cargo. And in some places, the captain would go ashore and he would bid for cargoes. It was that time then when you did that sort of stuff. Anyhow, very, very briefly, this is where Lindy Lighthouse comes into the issue. I've forgotten the second trip as an apprentice. This is important because this is medical. And there's a gap of 30 years before the discovery of what had happened to Captain George Williams, who was the captain on my second trip as an apprentice. I'd been at sea now for 6 months, had a little bit of leave, and I'd gone away again. And Captain George Williams was affectionately known because we sailed from Liverpool this time with a Scouse crew. And Liverpudlians are notable for humour and giving people nicknames, and they called him Tag. Oh, Captain Tag, not in his hearing, of course. But I didn't know what it was, and of course acronyms hadn't been invented then. In fact, this could have been the very first occasion that an acronym was formed. T-A-G, Tag. But I didn't dare ask them what it meant. But I found out. Because when we got to anywhere where there was not in heavy weather, but going into port or coming out of port, situations of stress, Captain Williams was afflicted by a very unfortunate condition known as hyperflatulation, and which, for those who are not sure, it means furious farting, but I didn't want to say that because it's coarse. And he would flatulate furiously, which was his stress, but he also caused stress to others, particularly the man at the wheel, who was trapped in the wheelhouse with him, and the third mate who would operate the engine room telegraph, also in the wheelhouse. The Brazilian pilots knew him because he'd been on the run for quite some time, and so they would work on the outside of the bridge. In those days, we did not have radio communication with the tug like a VHF. So for the forward tug, the pilot would have a whistle, like a policeman's whistle. I think they were actually trained by New Zealand sheep farmers because they would give a certain number of beeps and blasts for the forward tug, and he would not knew what to do. But for the after tug, you use the ship's foghorn, the ship's whistle. And I've seen the stress in the pilot's face when there would be an unfortunately timed flatulation from Captain George, and the stern tug would actually obey this. Tear ass George. Typical Liverpudlian. Oh, but I mean, nobody, well, you couldn't laugh, and my hair went grey in my 40s, but other than that, there was no damage. Aldington Court, I'll be very brief on this because it's just an interesting thing, the art of very basic navigation. We'd loaded all sorts of stuff in a place called Chittagong, which was in Pakistan, but it's not Pakistan now, it's Bangladesh. It's in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. And then we'd gone down to Calcutta, and then we'd loaded some more in Ceylon, which is not Ceylon anymore, it's now Sri Lanka. And so we set sail from Ceylon for Tanganyika, which is not Tanganyika now, it's Tanzania. And this is very confusing, especially for the elderly. Anyway, we set sail from Colombo, and of course it was all sextant navigation, but we never saw the sun for the whole passage, or a star, because it was the monsoon season. And this place called Lindi is just a bit north of Zanzibar on the East African coast. And it had what was glamorously called on the chart a beacon. So you could recognize it because there was nothing but flat desert behind it. Now it's different, but then it was. But when we picked up the African coast after this long passage and no sights, there was no beacon. And the old skipper, because he was skilled in the art of navigation, he said, right, we will turn north and we'll run north until we see the beacon for 24 hours. And if we don't see it in 24 hours, we'll go south for 48 hours until we see it. Because that's the only way you could do. You couldn't do anything else. No radio direction finding, nothing. A magnetic compass and a sextant. Anyhow, we shot off north. He was right. That's why he was the captain. And we found Lindy and all was well. But it was just interesting that with the best will in the world and all these officers with sextants and a chronometer that was very accurate, and all the tables, we still didn't know where the hell we were because the sun didn't come out. And nor did the stars, incidentally. They all went out together. It was the start of unionism. Anyway, survived that on the Aldington Court and eventually got back to the UK and paid off and decided that really this wasn't what I wanted and it was taking longer than I'd anticipated to be the captain. So I managed to get a shore job. Well, it was a job as mate and then skipper on a fishery tow vessel. These weren't naval vessels. These were government run, but they were civilian vessels. And this was great because we were only away 10 days at a time, and my wife remembered me, and I actually saw my little girl, my daughter. Life was good. And then the first serendipity happened. Serendipity means happiness. It means the right place at the right time, all that sort of good stuff. And I didn't even know about it, never heard of it. But now, if I ever managed to get a boat that was new, so I could put the name on it, I would call it Serendipity. But it happened to me because right at that time, the government in the UK decided that they wanted to investigate the effects of pollution on marine life, commercial species of marine life. Because everything that went in all the rivers and all sorts of learned people looking at those, it all finished up in the sea and nobody was doing it. Not a soul. So, by some fluke, I got the job to do this, mainly because they needed somebody who could do hydrographic work as well. In other words, find out where they were on the water, so they knew where they'd put the samples and things. So I got this job, and because it was a government organization, I was sent down to London University and trained in microbiology and zoology, and then sent to work with a chap called Dr. Lewis Klein, who wrote the textbooks on water analysis. All this wonderful stuff, and then they gave me a day off a week to go to college to get a degree level in biochemistry and chemistry. Marvelous. And then they gave me lots of money to set up a laboratory to do this investigation stuff. And so for probably 6, 7, maybe even 8 years, life was fantastic. I loved it. It was absolutely fantastic. But nothing stays the same forever. People change, situations change, and things change there, and it just became an impossibility to remain happy and stay there. So I resigned, and I went back to sea. But I went back as skipper of short international voyage tankers, 2,000, 3,000 ton tankers. That 250 feet, 300 feet long. They're not great big things. But of course, they didn't have bow thrusters. And it was at the time coming up to where the Suez Canal was blocked, if you remember. And the first super tankers were built then. So these were drive yourself ships. So the total crew, including me, was 7. So I was the skipper and there was a mate. Then we had a chief engineer and a second engineer. She was a motor ship. And a cook and a deckhand and a deck boy. And the deck boy had to be young and nimble because we had to be able to put him on the wharf wherever we went, and he jumped off the ship and took the ropes because there was nobody else. So this was a wonderful existence, a wonderful learning curve in ship handling. And I actually enjoyed it till the strain got a bit much. But all of a sudden, I learned what had happened to Captain Williams all those years before, and felt sorry because I couldn't contact him now to apologize for laughing occasionally together with the pilot out on the bridge. And this happened going into Waterloo Dock in Liverpool. And the River Mersey also has a 30-foot rise and fall at the tide, on spring tides. And the tide runs at 6 knots. And if there's a hell of a lot of rainfall, it runs at 7. And Waterloo Dock is, you have to go in through locks, as you probably know. In Europe, you have to go through locks because of this amazing rise and fall. On the flood tide, going into Waterloo Lock with the ship was quite easy. No problem. But going in on the ebb tide was a nightmare because the lock entrance faced up the harbour, faced up the river. So you had the tide behind you, but the tide also hit the dock wall and created a big eddy, and so you had to keep the engine in gear. Well, there was no gear. Keep the engine going, dead slow ahead, to keep steerage way on until you got in the lock. Otherwise, she sheared off, and you hit the bull nose and bent things and crumpled them up, and the owners got excited. And so you went into the lock faster than you would wish. And on this occasion, this was the Marine Fairway. She was beautiful, and I didn't want to bend her. And we were fully loaded with light crude for Shell going in. And so I had her going slow ahead with a 6-knot tide behind us. And so we were probably doing about 7 or 8 knots going into the lock. And the idea was, as soon as the forecastle head went in between the 2 lock gates at the entrance, you stuck her on half astern, not full, because full would have sheared her against the wall. Half astern, put the helm hard over to port, and slowed the ship down, and then glided gracefully into the lock, and that was fine, and occasionally it happened. But on this time, when I rang for half astern, because the funnel was just here behind the wheelhouse, I heard her fire and kick and stop, fire and kick and stop again. And what had happened was the chief couldn't get her because of no gearbox, direct drive. So to go astern, you stop the engine, the valves get cranked over the other side, and then you start it up the opposite way around. But because we were ploughing ahead so fast and deeply laden, the propeller wouldn't stop turning in ahead. And so the chief couldn't get her to fire in astern. And so we're gliding along towards the big wooden lock gates at the far end, with the water in the dock something like 20 feet higher than we were in the lock. And the lockmaster was running along the wharf, and we managed to get a stern line on, big 3-inch thick stern line, and it went through the full musical scale right up to top E, and then broke. Honestly, it was quite tuneful, but it parted, and the lockmaster shouted, I'm in the wheelhouse by myself playing with this useless engine telegraph and the wheel, and he shouted, stop that, and now we have to beep, ship. And I shouted back, if you can stop that beep thing, you can have it. And the lockmaster was going redder in the face, partially from running and partially from excitement. And I was just sort of paralyzed because these lock gates were coming nearer. And at last she fired a stern. And I rang double full of stern, which you don't often do. And everything shook, and we all grabbed onto our plate and our false tooth. And she vibrated, and we stopped about 6 feet off these big gates, these big wooden gates. Two things from this. Many years before, a big steam tug in Liverpool had gone into the Gladstone lock, where in Gladstone lock, all the big passenger liners, the Cunard and Canadian Pacific, Royal Mail, all those big liners used to berth in Gladstone dock. And she went in at low water when the dock was 30 feet higher, steam tug, big one, and she didn't stop. And she hit the lock gates and sprung them, and the tug was washed out of the lock, rolled over, and all hands, we went down with all hands in the Meuse. And the water all rushed out of the dock, and all these big liners sat on the bottom, and some listed away from the wharf, and the gangways fell down. It was a nightmare. And I was visualizing this as we were going ahead still before she'd stopped, and I couldn't help hearing Mr. Garrett again with his three most useless things, and me being the third one, and I thought he was right. But the medical implication of this is down to, and I think it's another acronym, and I believe I invented it, and the acronym is ESO. It's a condition, a medical condition called ESO, common in shipmasters and in mariner berth owners, in particularly with furling head sails and a fair bit of wind hamper. And ESO stands for excessive sphincter oscillation. And what happens with this excessive sphincter oscillation is that the valve, just like anything else, wears more quickly and becomes loose and not strong. Hence, the flatulation problem. The problem with the flatulation problem is that on the frequency scale, we're now talking melodic, not how often, is in the lower register. And therefore, if you just notice this sort of thing, but if you're ever using a tug, now of course, if you're not using VHF, do be careful, because the lower register can match the air horn of a modern motor vessel and the steam horn, the steam whistle on some steam ships. So it was a very interesting exercise, and 30 years in between the observation and the discovery, which in medicine, Tom, you'd think is a pretty reasonable period, isn't it? Yeah. Anyhow, again, things were not really good, and so I, by all sorts of reasons, got offered a job in New Zealand to do fishery research work. And so we sold the house. My wife sold the house while I was still at sea. I took the marine fairway into Liverpool on the 23rd of December 1971, paid the crew off, paid myself off, and in early January jumped on a big passenger ship together with my family, and we came to New Zealand, and we arrived on the 11th of March. You'll note the detail if you are jumping on the 11th of March 1972 at 6 p.m. And again, there was about 70% cloud cover that day, and a southwesterly breeze. It was uncanny. But My sister-in-law, who had married a New Zealander, came down in the Ford Anglia and picked us up from Princess Wharf and took us to her house that evening, and there was a telegram waiting for me. And it said, Croft, please report Ministry of Fisheries, Custom House soonest. And I thought this was sort of just like Captain Mannering used to talk in, Dad's army. This was real good military stuff, but it was important. So I did. I was there on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. And by 9:30, I was out in Custom Street, having been advised that unfortunately, during my absence at sea on the passenger ship, the government had had a change of heart due to financial situation and had decided not to set up this laboratory to do this work. And in simple terms, I was out on my ear. There was no work. And so I walked all the way to Ferguson Wharf and on and off the ships. And you could just go on and off them then with no security. And asked, any jobs. Don't care what, night watchman, sweeping hold. Nothing. Until I got to Wynyard Wharf. And I walked down Wynyard Wharf and there was a little shed on the end with Parry's Towing Company over the end. You'll notice I've skipped about the towing Dracones and deep sea towing because there isn't time for that. And it's not as exciting. And so I went into it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Important times important. And went in there, and there was one man in, and it was like a scene from Charles Dickens. There was a sloping desk at the end, and he was writing in a big ledger, and I was sure he was using a full pen, but he wasn't. And I told him my story. And he said, when could you start? I said, I can start now. I'd like to get changed because I was in a suit. I'd start now. He said, start at 8 o'clock. I'll sign you on now. He said, there's a deckhand's job on the Otarpery, one of our totes. So I signed, chuffed to pieces. He said, I better show you where she is. And we went outside, and it was low water. And we looked over the wharf down this ladder. And there was this little green tug at the bottom called the Otarpery. He said, be here at 8. Don't be late. The captain's called George. And I thought, oh, here we go again. But it wasn't. It was fine. It was a different George. And he said, the captain and the crew will be down, and you'll be right. So I went home on the ARA bus, 50 cents to Epsom. And, told my family, look, good news, get Julie, my daughter, into school. We're not going to leave Auckland. I've got a job. And I went down, and I was there. My sister-in-law took me back in the port. And I sat on the wharf because I was early. And I went in, I took my sea boots. I went in sea boots and a big woolen jersey because it was evening and quite cool. And jeans. I thought that'll be warm enough. 50 cents in my pocket for the bus fare back next morning. And then George and the crew came and said, oh, let's get aboard. We shackled this barge on that, which was empty. And we set off down the harbour. And it was like quite busy getting organised. So by the time we were off Devonport, the crew were all in. We're all having a cup of tea in the wheelhouse. And then they started asking me what I was doing there and where I come from because they'd heard about my background from the man in the Charles Dickens office. And so by the time we'd gone through all this and I'd explained, because I'm a bit long-winded, we were off Rangitoto Light and heading out. And I said, it was my turn to ask. So I said, what's the job tonight, skipper? Oh, he said, we're going to Whangarei to load fertilizer. Now, in all these travels at sea, I'd been everywhere except New Zealand. I'd never been to New Zealand. I didn't even see it when we went with a load of phosphate from Nauru down to South Auckland, to South Australia rather. We went down through the Tasman, but we didn't see New Zealand. So I knew nothing. I'd only been here since Saturday, and it's only Monday. So he said, we're going to Whangarei and we're going to load fertilizer in the barge. We take it to Hohora. He said, and it gets discharged into trucks. And then he said, we're going to Parenga and we load a special stone there and we take that to Panmure. Gosh, I said, it seems a lot for one shift. And he said, who said anything about the shift? Well, I said, look, I'm not complaining, because I didn't even know about Pomps complaining. I said, not complaining, but I just assumed since we started at 8, we'd be back in around about 8 in the morning. No, he said it's a 10-day trip. Oh, my God. So when we got to Whangarei, tied up next morning to the fertilizer factory, I said, I've got to let my wife know. I said, they'll be worried sick. So he said, well, go in and see if they'll let you use the phone in the factory. So I ran into this place. Everything was white. All the people were white. The machines were white. Everything covered in fertilizer. And I saw this guy and I told him my story. He said, oh shit. He said, it's a phone. It's a toll call to Auckland. I said, well, I've only got 50 cents. Well, look, he said, the foreman's out. Go over there. There's a phone on the windowsill. Make a quick call, but don't be long. So I went over to the windowsill and the phone is white. And of course the dial's white. And the numbers are the opposite way round than they are in the UK. So it took me about 3 goes to get the operator. Because I kept dialing 1 instead of 0. And, or 9 instead of 0. And anyhow, I told my wife and I said, look, expect me in 10 days, but at least I'm earning. And we loaded and off we went to Hohora. Well, when we got into Hohora, George said, well, look, you know, you can't drive the drag line. So he said, I'll have to get you to be in the barge, and you are the junior deckhand after all. And you will, with the shovel, to keep the scoop full and keep the phosphate all ready, the fertilizer. Said, oh, that's fine, that's fine. But by this time, I'd been aboard this ship for 2 days and noted that the crew didn't wear sea boots. They were in bare feet. And what's more, they were all in shorts. So I borrowed a knife and I cut my jeans off to make them shorts. And I took my sea boots and socks off and decided to be in bare feet. But mine were pommy feet. They had been trained in shoes since I was this big. So, oh my God, they were sore. Anyhow, in the barge and shoveling away, and we got up for lunch. And then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was hot. And I was covered in fertilizer. George, the skipper, leant over the gunwale and he said, John, get up here. We're going for dinner. I said, are we not eating on the tug like we knew? No, he said, we're going up to the pub. I said, but I've only got 50 cents. He said, it doesn't matter, he said, because they'd found out by now that I'm a guitarist. I enjoy playing guitar and do a fair bit of entertaining. He said, they've got an old guitar in the pub. If you'll play that, they'll give you a 4 and 20 pie and a pint. And that'll be your dinner. So he said, One-Eyed Jack's coming down and we need to be ready because he's impatient. So I said, what about a shower? No, he said, you're all right. This is Hohora. So One-Eyed Jack arrived in this ancient Vauxhall van. It was green. And he didn't have a patch. You could just see he only had one eye. The other looked horrible. But he also had a horrible dog. A big, black, woolly, stinking thing with a temperament similar to that of Mr. Garrett, the mate, if you remember. Yeah, charisma of a wire brush it had. Anyway, of course, when we went to the pub, the captain sat in the front seat with One-Eyed Jack, who was driving. So the 4 of us were in the back with the dog. And the dog was pissed off about not having a seat and being in the back. So it stunk and it snarled and it crawled over us, and it was a terrible trip. And of course they were all metal roads. Now I didn't know about metal roads because in England there weren't any metal roads, they were just cart tracks. And roads had asphalt, cement on them. And we're tearing along this metal road and this bloody old van slithering from one side to the other. And I said to George, is One-Eyed Jack all right driving at this speed? Are we safe on this road? Yeah, he said, he comes down here all the time. He knows it like the back of his hand. Don't worry. He said, mind you, on the way back when it's dark, he can't see at all. It is a bit heavy then. So I played guitar and I sang and I had my pie and my beer. And we went back to the ship and we got weatherbound. We were there for 3 days. So for 3 nights, I had a 4 and 20 pie and a beer. And I played and sang at the Hohora pub. I spent more time in the Hohora pub in my first week in New Zealand than people who'd lived there for years. And then we went to Paranger, and that's fine, and we loaded with stone and we came down. And I'd been to Paranger before half the people in New Zealand had been to Paranger. But there we were, and then I got off in Panmure with profuse apologies, and I said, look, it's nothing against you, George. It's merely that my career doesn't seem to be heading in the direction I'd anticipated. And he said, no, you're right. You get off. Because up to now, I'd only been unemployed for 6 hours on the Monday, and I didn't like it. It was an unpleasant feeling, unemployment. And so the truck driver, because I only had 50 cents, we couldn't get from Panmure to Epsom for 50 cents because you had to change buses, the big yellow ones. And so the truck driver took pity on me with his old stone truck, and unfortunately, it happened to be the most dilapidated one in the fleet of buses and full of stone. And he dropped me off at my sister-in-law's outside her house in Epsom, just as the school children were all coming home, and all the parents were outside. And of course, I hadn't shaved for 10 days, and I hadn't had a shower for about the last 3 or 4, and I had these raggedy cut-off shorts on. And my sister-in-law disappeared inside and was not impressed, absolutely unimpressed by this visitor. But by the end of that week, this was New Zealand in 72. By the end of that week, I had a truck and trailer license, which I've still got, up to 38 tons. And I was driving a 40-foot articulated truck for Car and Haslam. And I was still working with the sea because I was picking up containers off Ferguson Wharf, off the ships sometimes, and then off with the big travel lift things that picked them up. So I had a job within just a couple of days. I just had to get my license, and the Ministry of Transport rushed it through. They said, go and hire a truck, and there was a firm at the top of Queen Street that hired trucks and trailers for you to take your license in, the practical bit. So I went, I took my license and got it, and I drove for Car and Haslam for 6 months, which was wonderful. And then one day I kept writing to people to ask whether any jobs sort of perhaps slightly higher level than truck driver. And they, by the way, the wages were $56 a week on the big Arctics, and then on the small trucks, the flat top, they were $48 a week. And petrol was 33 cents a gallon, 33 cents for 5 litres of petrol at that time. But anyway, on the same day, I got offered 2 jobs. One was with the Auckland Regional Authority to do surveys in the Manukau and Waitata harbors. And the other was with McFarlane Fisheries, a little fishing company in Fanshawe Street. And they said, look, we've got this fishing boat, the Shenandoah, 55-foot fishing boat, and we want a marine farm set up at Waiheke Island and a research hatchery. And so I took that job. That was the next serendipity. The best thing that could ever have happened to me. Thank God the government job wasn't there. Thank God I didn't take the ARA, because I'm still working. Still fully employed, loving it, absolutely fantastic. And I met Tom Miller, because we set this thing up, and we were harvesting the mussels just for food, set the marine farm up, and don't want to get into a long story, but it was discovered in the US that these mussels contain properties, anti-inflammatory properties, that were valuable for treating arthritis. And so I had this laboratory, and I had a thermometer and a pipette and a couple of beakers, but it wasn't exactly suited for pharmacological research. So I went to see Tom Miller, and I was in great trepidation because he was right at the top of the tree, world famous medical researcher, and I'm going to ask him about this mussel for arthritis. And I thought, my God, I might get a bad reception. When I went into Tom's office in the lab, there were photographs. One was of Matuku, John's old boat, and these boats on the wall, all these sailing boats. Bond, right away, a wonderful bond. And still exists today. We sail out in our respective boats, join each other today. And Tom is responsible for starting and doing the initial research that has led to New Zealand greenlit mussel being world famous. Acetone, the product, is still expanding around the world. I'm still working with it, still giving lectures on it. Slightly more serious they have to be sometimes. And absolutely fantastic. That was the serendipity. The rest was the sea, and the other little bit was me. Thank you. Tell you about because I've imparted this information to Bob to help him with his meteorological career, that my grandfather taught me when I was still a very young child on the fishing smacks. And he said, comes the wind before the rain, soon you will make sail again. But comes the rain before the wind, because otherwise it doesn't rhyme, topsail sheets and halyards mind. And it was a description of frontal systems and what happens with them. And I told Bob, because I thought it would be helpful. Yeah, exactly. But my old grandfather told me that.